Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. This is our first uh, Podovi Bitcast in a long time. We were doing the CanJS Hangouts, but now we're switching to these Bittovi related ones because there's a lot of other tools and technology we want to talk about, and we might talk about other frameworks, kind of open technology discussion instead of limiting ourselves to just CanJS. But despite that, we're going to talk about CanJS a lot, and for today, I'm going to go through the 2.2 release article, and then I think Matthew is going to go through the StealJS stuff, I assume. You want to talk about that, Matthew?
Yeah, a little bit about kind of how to organize an open source project, CanJS and Steel, using those two.
Cool, awesome. So let me share my screen, and I will kick it off. So I'm mostly just going to be running through the finer points of this article, through this top 10 list. In general, I'm pretty happy about the 2.2 release. There was no like grand game-changing new features. There was just a lot of little improvements compared to 2.1. And I'll start with what I think is the most important one, is how nice CanJS can work in a Browserify and StealJS workflows. So I've got a little example app started, and I'm just going to kind of repeat some of my work, but not all of my work. And you guys, David and Matthew, can you see my font size already? All right.
Maybe more would be nice, I think.
Yeah, go a little up.
I could possibly do this. Okay. I might not be able to change the font size here, but I can change the font size here.
You can't do like Command plus? Does that not work?
No, not with my old man editor.
Okay.
And it always takes me forever to figure.
Well, while you're doing that, I just wanted to say I think a lot of what 2.2, maybe you would agree with this. A lot of what we did with 2.2 was just getting like our infrastructure in order to where we could more quickly develop new features going forward and do things more modularly with Can.
Yeah, I mean, our infrastructure is a little bit better if you're talking about for CanJS, but I think our infrastructure for Podovi as a whole, producing other open source projects, is vastly improved. Right? We can now finally create a plugin or extension to CanJS that people can use standalone or Steel or with AMD, and that's kind of what you're going to talk about, like the BitTabs example. And I think that's really powerful. So I think a lot of CanJS's next features will start off in these other side projects, like we're working on CanAnimate, and we're working on CanConnect, which is CanConnect is service middleware, so it can do caching and things like that of your AJAX requests. So those things will probably start as side projects and then maybe be brought into core. Or possibly that core itself starts getting broken up. Steel offers us a lot of flexibility.
I think that also means it'll be easier for people to upgrade it. But like upgrading to a new version of Can won't be such a big thing because hopefully it will I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but hopefully it'll be easier just because you can upgrade different parts.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, part of it is a little tricky with like how you pick those parts. It's not super easy. I mean, that's actually one thing that Bauer did right, is that you can kind of pick your dependency version. Node that's a little bit trickier to do stuff like that. But we'll definitely figure out those workflows soon, and this gives us a really good start. So let's talk about Steel. It's a good segue. So I've got this little example app, and I'm going to do the normal npm init, and I'm just going to hit enter a million times to create a little package.json, and I'm going to install CanJS. So I'm going to do npm install can, We use can instead of CanJS so that all the module names are consistent across Steel, AMD, and CommonJS. That's why it's not CanJS. This is why it's can, not CanJS. And I'm going to do the save. So it's installing is saved in my package.json. And because while I'm here, I'm going to show a Steel demo, I'm going to also install Steel. Now I'm going to start with showing Browserify, and I've installed Browserify globally. npm install Browserify-g. I've already done that. I'm not going to do it again because it takes a little bit. And I'm going to first start showing the Browserify workflow. Let me refresh to make sure everything is back. Okay, so here I am going to use in Node to require can stash jQuery, which is installed automatically because it's a pure dependency of can, and can view auto render because I'm going to show that off right now, and I'm going to create a little dummy hello world component that just says hello there whenever a hello world element is found. And I want to use this. I'm going to build this project into, what was I calling it? Let me see what Browserify. I'm going to build it into an out file that contains CanJS, CanStash, all of my dependencies, and this component. So I'm going to run Browserify main out.js. And build out.js. Right here, and you can see that'll have a whole lot of stuff in it, including the component. And if I open up that HTML page, let's see what's in this HTML page. This is using the new can auto render to automatically render this template into the page. It'll render it right after the script tag, and I'm loading out.js. Which is our Browserify built project. So with that, and let me show it working. So I get the hello there, which is what I would expect. And you can see in the page, I have the script tag, and then I have its contents rendered immediately after it. So awesome. I can do the same thing with Steel. Except I'm going to use ES6 to load the dependencies. So exact same thing, just dependencies are loading a little bit differently. And then I'm going to have a Steel HTML page that's going to look just the same, except that it's going to point at the Steel main for what Steel loads, and I'm going to have this, again, the same kind of text stash can auto render. It'll automatically render this hello world. And if I open up my Steel.html, you can see this works. The nice thing about Steel, of course, is that I didn't have to build anything. I can just use it straight away. Yep. Okay, so that's feature one. That's pretty exciting. Let me get back to...
Yeah, people have been requesting to have can and npm going back like a year, so I'm glad we can do that now.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the next fun thing is can event arguments. This allows you to programmatically specify your arguments you want to call back an event or a method in the scope. So for example, here I'm saying I want to call the item splice function with the index of the current item and 1. And this will remove a single item at the current index from items. So if I click this, you can see them being removed. Now, some other fun things you can do to this.
That's like a lot of times you'd have a boilerplate function that just did that. Like it didn't really do very much. I've seen this in a lot of our code.
Yeah, the old way, the old way is you could call methods with can-event, and they would only be passed as arguments the current context and the current scope. And with the current context and with the current scope, you could do all the same stuff, but you were always having to create these secondary functions to take the current context and scope, get the index or whatever other values you want out of it. Here's an example where I just created a log function that will log whatever I pass to it. And you can see here, you can also access things on the element and the event. So here, when I click, let me clear the console, I am logging out the event type. Now you can also do the element, but remember the element is a node list. So if you want the root element, node list meaning it's like it's jQuery, a jQuery wrapped element. So if you want the raw element, you have to do this .0, and then you can get something like the node name. That's why I get li. Let's see if actually, one thing I haven't tried, let's just see if it breaks, is if you do element.html, and that will call, it does work. So this is jQuery, any jQuery method you can actually call, which is pretty cool. So that's can event, taking arguments, very nice. The next thing are observable promises. So we now allow you to, if you pass an A+ promise to the template, and even if the promise implementation doesn't have an is pending, is resolved, or value properties, we kind of mask those and provide a facade that allows you to ask if the promise is pending or resolved. So if we take a look at this demo, you can see an AJAX request is being made that we're simulating with a fixture, and it takes a second, and we're passing the jQuery returned promise-like object. jQuery isn't totally A+, but that's fine, it works anyways. We're passing that to the template, and the template is going to ask while the promise is pending, show loading, and then until the promise is resolved, and then once the promise is resolved, go through the promise's value, which is an array, and list each item in the array. So when I run this, you get this kind of fun loading behavior. And this demo, we also include a bigger demo, which is based off the old can list promise demo, which shows loading. We're simulating a site service where a different parameter of type comes in, and depending if type is fun, educational, missing, or anything else, the behavior of what's returned changes. So you can see if I return educational, I get a different list of sites, and if I return, if I give it a missing parameter, it'll return a, it'll actually show that this error is here, and then if I do empty, it means it's some other parameter and there's no items. So you can see this list handles all the very common cases, which I'll show, I think, pretty elegantly, where you either get data and you list items, you get a successful response, but there are no items, and you get an error. So how this works is I'm using a component with a items getter using the define plugin to, whenever the type attribute changes, return a new promise. And that promise is going to be called items in the scope of this site app component. And value here, I'm cross-binding to this, type. I'm cross-binding to this select input. So its can value is type. Whenever this changes, it changes this type property attribute, and then when that changes, it reloads new items. So to handle those kind of very common list cases, I can check when it's loading, or when the promise is pending. I show loading, and when it's resolved, if there are items, I go through each one, and if there are not, I warn that there are no items. And if it was rejected, the reason property is going to be provided with whatever the promise rejects with. In the case of a jQuery made AJAX request, it's going to be that actual JQXHR object, which is going to have response JSON, which is whatever is this data right here, and that's why I can list the message. The warning, resource does not exist. So this, by and large, I think means we don't need the list promise plugin anymore, because this is kind of a superset that works with any promises. This is much better, in my opinion. So I would hope people start using it, because I think it's pretty nice.
Awesome. Yeah, we used to try to do, I know it's not as common, but sometimes you just want a single value, not a list, and there really wasn't a great way to do that before. So this will provide that.
Yeah, exactly. The find one case was always a big pain to do this with. And I hope that what I'm thinking is this might now open the door to relationships. So like, if you, it kind of already does, where if you have a single instance of, let's say, user, and you want to define all associated tasks with them, well, you might be able to do a user tasks attribute that is a promise that whenever that user changes, then also changes. So I think that finally having promises observable in the template are going to make a big difference for how rich and complex modeling can be done with a defined plugin. But we'll see.
Interesting.
So templates in the page with can auto render. I already showed this a little bit, but I'll pop open this JS bin to show it again. So for the most part, well, this is a kind of a good discussion in general, which is we had a long talk about whether we wanted to support just directly in the page templates, which would be nice, so that I could write, or components, so I could write my foobar component and have that just work. Now, while we could do this, the problem is you can't have mustache work in this kind of circumstance, because let's say you wanted to have a table and you wanted to go through some kind of each and then have a TR. The DOM just freaks out with stuff like this, and you can't actually embed mustache in this way. So the only alternative is to do something like what Angular does and lose what I would say is the expressive power of mustache and kind of a true templating language. Your language is only HTML. And although that's appealing, like kind of superficially, to be able to put everything in the DOM, I don't think it's worth it, because I would rather write, quickly and understandably than necessarily just limit myself to HTML, pure HTML templates. So as a kind of potential compromise, but I think works pretty well, we allow to put your templates in script tags, and with this can auto render, we will automatically render that like right immediately following the script tag, whichever one of these we find. And it also provides we also allow people to access the data that this is rendered with. By default, it'll just be rendered with a empty can map, but you can change the values of that can map. by getting the ID of the script tag, calling viewModel, and updating those properties. It should also be said that any additional attributes on the script tag are automatically set as values on the view model of what's used to render the template. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is really a great way of making demos and kind of bootstrapping an application's kickoff. So this is another example of that just shows using a here I've got a tabs widget or tabs component that I created, but I can just use that directly in my page, although it is in a script tag, but that's fine.
You need to import your tabs.
Not in this case. You would if you were using.
Why don't you?
Because the way JSBin works is that essentially the code right here is essentially run right after. So auto render will try to render all templates on document ready, and this code runs before document ready. So my tabs already exists at that point.
Right. And you can't use you need the system plugin for CanImport anyways.
Yes. Yeah.
So I have a question. So most examples I've seen, there's only been one auto render script per page. But what if you wanted multiple? I mean, you could do that.
Yeah.
Because you might want to have if you have a large application and you want to make like little widgets in various parts of it, that'd be a good way to do it. The only thing is, each script tag is like a top level scope, right? There's not a scope for all of the tags.
No.
Right? So if you want to communicate between them, I guess you could do that, but you'd have to wire that up yourself.
Yeah, you'd have to. Well, yes. I would imagine though that if you wanted to. I don't know why you wouldn't put it all then in one big script tag.
Well, the use case I'm thinking of, and I've actually talked to someone about this, is you have like more for a traditional server rendered application, and you want to start adding more dynamic stuff to it. So it's not a single page app. You don't just have one entry point. You might have, like little widgets spread out.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I would say it's a design choice that they'll have to kind of do, because if they're spread out but then also need to communicate, that's kind of a strain.
Right.
If it were me, I would just still start the page then with this ending and start ending script tag, and then have all your any other HTML is just totally fine to go in here. The only consideration might be SEO, but we have an answer for that probably pretty soon. But don't tell anybody. So yeah, that's Can Auto Render. Pretty nice. It's useful for demos and for quick bootstrapping applications. So CanImport is related to this, and related to the Steal workflow when you're using StealJS to load templates and things like that. In my example app, I created that same tabs component, and what I can do in my Steal HTML page is, if I wanted to import that, I could write CanImport, and I'll give it the module I want to load, which is tabs. And this will use, because I'm in Steal, it'll use Steal to import the tabs module before this template is rendered.
It's probably worth mentioning that it works with require.js too.
Yeah, it does work with require.js, and it'll work with if it finds a system loader, it'll work there. It does try to require it as well, but that like doing this in a CommonJS workflow just doesn't quite make sense. Yeah, so we'll have to figure out how to, like, if we do want to empower this for those kind of workflows, a way to do that. But anyways, I need to actually add some tabs code to my page. So I'm going to steal this code right here. I'll put that in place. And now, hopefully, I should see not a styled tabs widget, but a something like that. Here's my, I'll have to find it again. What was it? My example app. And it did not work. Hold on. Oh, there it worked. Okay. So my tabs works, but it's not styled. Cool. Surprisingly, why did hello world disappear? I don't know. This was working 2 seconds ago before this video. Oh, it is there. It's at the end of the tabs, which is what should have happened. Okay, so that's CanImport. It's really nice when you're using this in the StealJS workflow, because a lot of times templates have dependencies. They have helpers, or they have components that they're using, and it makes sense for them to have templates. It's a little weird, and sometimes when we've told people we're adding this, they're like, "You're crazy. A template can't have dependencies." But once you start using it, you do realize that, you know, just because this template might be rendered by like some other component or some other widget or the main app itself, doesn't mean you should make tabs a dependency of that higher order component or module, because it's nice to keep what your dependencies are next to where they're being used. Right? So it's, if this template were to change, it's much more, and I were to remove my tabs, it's much more likely I'll remove this dependency as well.
And you need this for CanView adders as well.
Yes. So that can be very, yeah. So sometimes if you have custom attributes, very good point. My thing. So you have a custom CanView adder registered, so that anytime my thing is a custom attribute, you have some behavior that adds, you know, something that adds some behavior to this div every time the my thing attribute is found. Well, you need to load that attribute prior to this template being processed, because otherwise, for performance reasons, CanStash just will kind of ignore this attribute. It won't try to like call out to do this behavior, because otherwise it'd have to be looking for behavior on every single property. So you absolutely need to, this is actually one of the only good ways of solving that, to get my thing registered always before this template is processed, is with the CanImport. Really, really good point.
I have a question too. If you import in a template and you build it, is the dependency going to be included in the build with Steel?
Yes, it is.
So it runs the template during the build?
Yes, plugins are actually run.
Oh, that's cool.
That was one of the key features that when we built the new Steel, was getting plugins to run. Yeah, one of the key parts.
Cool.
Okay, so next feature. Okay, so we renamed scope because this just was a nightmare to explain the different types of yeah.
Sorry, I can't stop from laughing because it's so true.
Yeah, every CanJS training I would do, I would be trying to describe can component scope or former scope, and I would do that also right after having talked about Mustache and how it has a scope, or Stashin has a scope. It would be really confusing what you were referring to, because although can component scope could actually be a can view scope and be implemented and was actually modifying, adding to the scope and kind of defining the scope of what the components template was rendered with. It was just too confusing and was never really used that way. It was always used as the component's view model primarily. So we renamed it view model, and to hopefully clear things up, what people are talking about and what these things mean. So just a few terms that are good to quickly talk about when people mention things. So template context. So when a mustache template is, actually let me find the, I want to find that first example with for can event. I think that's the easiest one to understand. So when a template is rendered, at any point in the template, you can kind of point to its current context, right? The current context within this, with kind of starting inside this section, is each individual item, right? The context outside of there is the this kind of object that was used to render the template, right? The context is the first item whose values you're going to look on, or what you're going to look for in that object. It's kind of hard, these prepositions. It's the first object with which you're going to look in for properties. So this can click, when it actually is looking for item splice, it's actually going to look for items first on the item. And if one of these had an items property, it would actually call that item splice. Right? To control this, you can start using the ... operator. If you haven't seen that before, to kind of be explicit about where you're looking for properties. But that's the context. It's the first item you're going to look for. Now, all of those contexts, if you take all of them, all the items that you can look for, that's the template scope. And the scope changes again at any point. So the scope at this point, right where these each is happening, well, there's just one item, and that is the current context. But in here, or like item splice, the scope is the current item followed by the object that was used to render the template. So that's the scope. It's like all of the context. You can think of it as like, if in JavaScript, you might look inside of a call object or closure, but then the combination of all of those things is your scope within a function in JavaScript. That's like the template scope. And then finally, now there's the component view model, and this is just a CanMap instance that is defining what will be a CanMap instance that is used to render the template as the context of the template, kind of the first item that template will look like. When you're directly within a component's template, it's going to look on its view model. So hopefully that clears things up. I think it has for us at least already. Okay, so I'm going to already go in a little bit longer than I wanted, so I'm going to try to keep these next ones real quick. Define plugin improvements. This mostly is if you look at CanJS's docs, these things have finally been hardened and the behavior kind of well established now for the define plugins getter. That it takes the last value that someone set on the attribute as an argument, an optional argument, and then it can also take, there's a signature where it can take an asynchronous setter, where you can kind of set things after the fact. So this is all kind of well defined, and now there's some good examples and kind of description of the behavior. That's really nice. The example itself here isn't great. It's not my best example. It just kind of shows this kind of the behavior, not necessarily what you can do with it, because I couldn't come up with one right away, even though I have used it. But I actually personally haven't used the combination setter and getter yet myself, but I'll quickly go through what this does. This defines a person that until the person property is set, it defines a person property that until the person property is set, the actual person value will be determined by a person ID property on this same object. So I'm creating an instance and I'm listening to when person changes. And when I set the person ID property to 5, it's going to request, it's going to see that, oh, last value, it hasn't been set yet, so I'm going to find the person representing person 5, and once that's retrieved, I'm going to set the person property to person 5, whose name is Jose. But after a second, then I'm actually going to directly set the person property to a person named Julia, and then that essentially overwrites the kind of secondary looked up value of this person. So no matter what person ID is, it's going to always be what the person's set to. So this was just to kind of illustrate the richness of behavior that defines can now provide. And it's just well established now, so hopefully anything that you can come up with, getters and setters should be able to accomplish for you. Kind of hard to express, though, why that's awesome, at least for me. But it is.
Mm-hmm.
Sortable lists. This is a very cool demo. This was done by our Chris Gomez at Podovi because he needed it for a project. I think the demo mostly just speaks for itself. So lists can have a comparator property, and that is used to automatically sort the list. So here I've cross-bound a sort by, the sort by select element with the list's comparator, so that when I change the list, it automatically, or sorry, when I change the comparator property, it automatically resorts the list, which is cool. And that's really all you have to do now is there's this live bound property that whenever it changes, it just resorts the list.
Is it?
Huh?
Sorry, is that? So I was kind of wondering what the relationship was to the old sort plugin. So I guess that's it. Is that it's now live bound?
Yeah, it's live bound and it like works right.
Well, I didn't want to say that, but yeah.
Kind of weird and only work in certain situations, and this one works in a lot more and a lot better. And it's live bound, so you just change it and it automatically will do the resort. Also, if items are added or removed to this list, which isn't shown in this demo, they will be inserted in the appropriate place. And if this is the very cool thing, I think, that if let's sort by name, and if I were to change someone's name, it automatically resorts the list. So you'll notice one thing we haven't quite done yet is to keep focus on the sort. That's actually pretty relatively doable because we're actually not, when this happens, when an item is removed or is moved, now there's a move event, so we're not redrawing the whole list. We're literally just picking up these elements here and moving them into their new place. So sort stuff, awesome. Number 9 is kind of a technical change that I wanted people to be aware of. Hopefully it shouldn't cause many problems, but we changed events so that they always was placed at the end of the queue during a batch. So if you had done something like this previously, created a map, listened to when its A property changes and change its B property. If you had done A and C change in a batch, formerly it would have not fired. It would have prevented firing off events until the stop happened, but then it would have fired off the A, which would have immediately fired off the B, and then the C would have fired off. Now every event gets added to the end of the event queue, which means that A will fire off. B will actually be set to change, but the event won't be dispatched until C has fired. So it'll go A, C, and then B. So this actually, when we added this change, it kind of demonstrated or highlighted some problems in our code that actually weren't working properly with batched events. So we fixed those, and we made it kind of easier to fix it if you do have code that does the same thing. The problem is essentially you can get the state of an object. So like you can see here that this A event handler is, like, before B is fired, is actually getting, inside here, if I were to do map and look on map, well, A and C are both, there's a C event still going to fire, and there's actually a B event, if I were looking before here, there's an A and C event going to fire. But all I've seen is the A event. So sometimes you want to know, like, if I were to look at map and was setting some stuff up based upon map's current state, well, map's state has already been set, but all the events haven't been dispatched on the map. So you need a way of knowing, like, okay, well, when has everything been fully fired on this map? We added a can batch after previous events, and this callback will get called when all previous events have been fired on pretty much every single object. So that's a good place to, whoops, that's not what I want to do. That's a good place to set up bindings and things like that, because you won't be listening to an event that's already fired that is kind of already, the state already reflects it, that event. I don't know if that makes sense, but if you do find yourself these problems, you can watch this video like 5 times and then ask me a question, and I'll explain it. I'll try to come up with a better explanation. And then finally, leak scope. This was to prevent a very common problem where you would have a value looked up in the scope that really shouldn't have been there, or was looked up by mistake on some parent context. So I want to just briefly talk about this.
So in this case, we want it not to go up the scope, right? Up the context.
Yes, exactly. So here I have a house sale, and a house sale has an offer price inside of it. And offer price has this little showing value. Its template is just trying to look up a showing value. And you can see here that, maybe my offer price should not be, we don't want that widget, we want that widget it's showing to be explicitly passed. We don't want it to just go randomly find some potential parent showing property and actually put that there. But this is exactly what happens. There's this leak scope option where if we change that, then it doesn't allow the template of the component to find properties in the kind of surrounding context of the template, or of the component. So it doesn't allow showing to be found from house sale, the parent.
You could get the same effect with using the / operator just for that property, right? But this encapsulates the entire component scope.
Exactly. So you don't, you could do exactly that, but this means you don't have to. So that's all I'm going to talk about that. There's some more kind of better examples and how to fix it, but that's all it really does, is it just limits the component. It's the values that its template will be able to, the context in which that template will be able to find values, it limits it to just the view model, essentially, of the component. So that's it from me. You guys have any questions?
Well, I was going to ask about 2.3, but maybe we should wait until next.
Yeah, we can wait until next time. We'll leave a little something to hopefully get people to come back and watch this for.
Awesome.
So I think Matthew, you want to talk about?
I'll talk about Still. I'm not going to go through our entire Still release article. Let me share my screen. Because really, our release article is more of an argument in favor of Still rather than a list of features, but it does have some features, so let me just talk about them very briefly. So the coolest thing that Still is always, okay, so I should back up. Still is our module loader and build optimizer tool. Still dates back, what, like 7 or 8 years, something like that. About a year ago, it was rewritten to be more modern, to fix some problems we had with building specifically. I think I would say probably around October was when I would say like it was like starting to get to the point where it was really good, and we kind of figured out, how to make it work. We'd fixed most of the problems that the old Still had at that point, and we started kind of looking for new stuff to fix. And a lot of that had to do with configuration. So that's what some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is. We built plugins to make it work very easily with Bower and NPM. So one of the really essential features, and I'll talk about this in a future podcast, but is that it works. It has an optimizer for working with progressive loading. So it optimizes your code so that breaks it into separate bundles, so that you're always kind of to optimize for caching, and so that you're reusing your code in production the best way. That's kind of really the best feature. So in the future podcast, I'll create a demo of that and explain all of that.
Do you think it's the best feature now? I sometimes think the exporting is actually the I think
it's the best feature. It might not be the most marketable, but I think it's the most useful. Yeah.
I think yeah.
I don't know, but it's the most unique feature, I think, at least.
Yeah.
You can do some of this other stuff, even though the exporting, and I'm going to write an article about our exporting tool, is pretty unique in what it can do. But yeah, so October, I think we got to the point where all of that stuff that we had already had was working very, very well in the new Still, and we set out to like, hey, let's solve configuration, because configuration client-side loaders is like it's a huge pain. Even if you know what you're doing, there's still like some guesswork to configure a lot of time. So we thought, hey, there's Bower, there's NPM. Like, what if we can make these work? And I spent like a couple of months trying to get a good Bower plugin to work, and went through several iterations. And then me and Justin were talking about it, and I think it was in November, and we kind of finally figured out like how do we build this kind of thing. And so we released the Bower plugin, and then we're like, hey, maybe we could do NPM. And Justin did an NPM plugin, and that was the like explosion moment, I think, for Still, to where now it's enabled us to do a lot of cool stuff in other projects. So better workflows is another huge thing.
Is Bower dead now, though?
Bower's not dead.
Not dead. Long live Bower.
I think from our perspective, I think we're going to focus on NPM, but Bower, it works most of the time. So I think it's something we should continue to maintain.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say it works. Well, it works. The thing about Bower is, the thing about NPM, I would say, is that it has like this nice contract, is that every module, there's a contract to be modular, I guess, in NPM, and that's kind of the great benefit for it, because it's built with CommonJS in mind, whereas Bower's not. But anyways, this is the release article. There's some really cool videos. If you go to StealJS.com, you can see the videos as well.
Really cool videos.
Very cool, yeah.
Various videos.
I'll post this to our Hangout, so you can read that if you haven't already done so. But I wanted to talk about a project we have called BitTabs, which kind of demonstrates some of the cool things that Still can do. A lot of people for a long time have been asking us, how do we release like open source components because everyone wants to do this, right? So we've kind of finally got to the point where we're starting to do this ourselves. I don't know about you guys, but I think we should have some type of page that like lists all the components, maybe on CanJS or Podovi or something. But
what's that parent? Oh, that's confusing to me.
oh gosh, you're right. I was just thinking about that when you were talking. I wonder if So it should be
There's the one on line 18 too, and 21.
line 18.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Confusing.
Yeah, I haven't updated this apparently for that at least.
Don't worry about it. I don't know.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah, I'm not going to really talk about because she's seen 1,000 tab examples in this very podcast, so why would you want to see it in another one? But this is a real tabs. This is the usage that if you're using Steel, a great way to use it. Kind of like what Justin showed with Can Auto Render. You import the tabs and then you just list it, and your main is Can View Auto Render, and it just automatically does it. It's really cool. But I really want to talk about the project structure and how you can build your own open source components. And as you see, we have a source folder which contains a BitTabs, your stash, your less, everything you need. Now, this is not the way that you would probably structure your project kind of in a large application, but for like a small open source library, it works fairly well. So to make this work, there's a configuration option called directories lib. So if you're using the npm plugin, which you absolutely should be, there's a system section that you can add, and these are basically ways to add any type of configuration that you could do in a Steel config. You can do the same kind of thing in this system property. So one of the things we're doing here is setting a directories lib. And what this says is all of our source code is contained within this source folder. So if someone were to do import BitTabs / tabs.stash, I don't know why they would do that, but if they wanted to do that, then that would work. If you didn't have this, it would look up files just in the base folder.
Can you quickly show how to load the less file? Because I think we haven't talked about that.
How to load the less file? Oh,
yeah, like the loader, how this works, because it was kind of cool.
The importing, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can just import a less. You put a bang after it that tells it to use the less plugin, and then it will just import that into your page.
Yeah, same for stash and
same for stash, yeah.
For like plugins.
Yeah, this is how you do plugins. In the future, we'll probably change it so that you don't have to do this bang. You can maybe configure that. Well, you can already configure that, but you still have to do the bang. So we'll probably in the future make it so you don't have to do the bang. But anyways, yeah, that's a way to do that. What was I? Yeah.
I did really quick while you were talking about the npm, just because I think that's one thing that people haven't found. If you go to StealJS.com API, click on Steel, you can see under modules, these are like different modules you can load or are plugins that you can load when you write package.json bang npm. This kind of talks about how you use the configure and all the options there. So when Matthew was talking about the system property, this is where you can, all the things within that system property that you can change. And there are some things that in your package.json that we respond to, even if they're not inside that system object, and that's the, there's this main and there's browser, global browser. These are kind of Browserify's configuration options that it supports. This is where you find all that information. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, that's one thing I wanted to say was, so you have a main, which is going to be interpreted by, like, for example, Browserify, as this is your main entry point. As you can see here, we have it pointed to the dist folder, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. But this is not the main that you're actually going to use if you're using Steel. you can override the main within the system. So this says our main is BitTabs, and because we've said that our directory's lib is source, this is going to be your actual main. So something to keep in mind. So yeah, that's the configuration. Once you've created your BitTabs, you probably want to build it. So to do that, we have a feature called StealJS, which is really nice. We're using Grunt here, but you don't have to use Grunt. You can use whatever you want. So StealJS is a way to export your project into another format, essentially. If you're writing your project in ES6, well, that can't be used by Browserify. That can't be used by Require.js. There's always situations where, for example, on JSBN, you want to have a global. And StealJS allows you to do that because it wasn't an intentional feature, I wouldn't say, Justin, right? Because of the way that we built the build, that we're transpiling all the code anyways, and we have the ability to transpile into other formats, it made it very easy to create this. Essentially, it was created to accommodate CanJS's build. CanJS is a very complicated build, so we needed a way to provide all the different options. This has an extreme large number of options. You can control the way modules are named when you're transpiling them. You can configure where the code goes on a module by module basis. I'm not going to go over all those features. I'm going to write more about this in the future. But that's what these options are.
There was a long Twitter argument I got with I think it's Brian LaRue, or I don't know how to pronounce his last name. One of the React or someone of JavaScript Note. I forgot his last name, and we were how what projects should export and things like that. And he wrote I think he wrote an article about how UMD was just could not work, and I had this long discussion about how but that can't work, but you can export to all the different formats. And then he's like, well, that's terrible, which I agree with, but I did agree that he's like, that is the format then that everybody has to export to. And I'm like, yeah, that kind of is. And he's like, that's terrible, and I agree that it's terrible, but it's what you have to do if you're an open source project. You have to export to CommonJS, AMD, and standalone, and hopefully soon ES6. You just have to. So we wanted to provide a tool that let people do it and also make it so it works with a lot of dependent projects. So you can start building up this ecosystem of all these different projects that depend on each other, but you can still build it in each one in that chain so that they work in any workflow. That's kind of how this all came about.
Yeah, exactly. So to get back to what I was talking about, because you're using the npm plugin here, our config is our package.json. This bang says you're using a plugin, and the part after is the name of the plugin. So we're using the npm plugin against the package.json. Because we defined our main is defined within here, we don't have to repeat that in our grunt file here. So like I was saying, the StealJS allows you to have full control over the way that you export, but there's a lot of common formats that you want to use. So we have in this idea of helpers, which means if you put this plus next to a string, it means that we're using the CGS helper. So instead of having to manually, what you could do is, if you weren't using the CGS plugin, is you could say the format is CGS, normalize is a function, and you go through the process of making it normalize in the way that you want a CommonJS to normalize. But because you're using the helper, you don't have to configure all of that. So for the common case where you just want to export to CommonJS, to AMD, and to standalones, you can just add these options here. And if you want a little bit more fine-grained control, like you want the destination file to be dir name plus dest/BitTabs, you can do that as well. So yeah, you can any configuration option you can add to these helpers. But by doing this, when you run grunt build, it will create a disk folder and all of your different files are here. So like here's our global. If we had source maps turned on, which we did, it would create a source maps file right alongside, which is awesome. Which means that if you're importing BitTabs into your project, you can actually see the original source, which is pretty cool. This is like the global.
I was actually wondering, how do you specify what property is exported globally?
You do that within your code. So
whatever you return.
Well, like we don't. Yeah, we maybe we should add this, but right now you can't specify like something that's set on the global. You would just like within BitTabs, you could say, you know.
Oh, you say window.
Yeah. That's how you do it now. That's how Can's always done it. I guess it would be nice because if you're like using CommonJS, you don't really necessarily need to have a global. So if there was a way to say, hey, we want our global to be Can, you wouldn't have to. It would never have to be on the window except for in the globals.
I mean, we could do that with the exports option that already like kind of is the reverse side of that, so that hey, if jQuery, you're trying to build the global script and you have a module that requires jQuery, well, just look for jQuery on the window.
So how that works is like here, if we were using jQuery, we could say we want the jQuery module name to mean window.jQuery. That's how export works. I thought this. I've always thought this was kind of misnamed because you're really importing window.jQuery into like your global context.
Yeah.
And so really, I would want exports to mean the opposite. But it's probably too late. We'll have to think of another good name for that. But yeah, that's something we could add as well.
Yeah. Well, I don't want you to give up one of the coolest parts and forget about it.
What
is to make sure it's well understood that this module is loading stash templates and less, but still building them in such a way that you can use it in CommonJS, AMD, or the global syntax.
Right.
And to me, that's very, very cool that we're not going to limit people to the types of, how they write their modules, right? You can write things that use less, or hopefully, if someone were to write a CommonJS plugin, you could, or not CommonJS, CoffeeScript plugin, you could write in CoffeeScript, and the system will be able to take that and compile it down to JavaScript and CSS, and then it's made so like if you look at the AMD, open up the AMD folder and take a look at, although hopefully David, you're driving right now and it's showing Matthew's screen,
yeah,
even though I'm talking.
What?
We'll just switch to showing you David for me, but if you look at the tabs less CSS, I'm sorry, not that one. Look at the tabs BitTabs.js.
Uh-huh.
You can see here we put the little CSS bang in front of tabs less CSS, so that if you're using the AMD CSS plugin, it just works. And if you're using the Browserify like CSSify plugin, it just Browserify just works. To me, that's really cool. I don't know. Hopefully other people find it.
I agree with that. So here's the CommonJS. As you can see, we're requiring tabs.stash.js, and that file is right here. So this gets compiled down to like an intermediate stash template. So yeah,
It's a
pretty cool.
compiled version of the stash template too, which is
Yes, again, it's it's an intermediate. So yeah, I think with Browserify there is a what is it called? CSSify that you can add, and it transforms. I forget how this works. Do you know what I'm talking about, Justin?
Yeah, so in your package.json, you just list CSSify like we're
Right.
doing as a transform. So if your project is like BitTabs and has a CSS dependency, you need to make sure you have this Browserify transform CSSify configured so that anybody who's dependent on this project will actually use CSSify to do the CSS transformation.
Mhm.
But yeah, to me it's just cool that I can pretty quickly and easily write an ES6 module that uses less and uses templates and export it to work in all these different workflows. And now with source maps in 0.80.
Yes, 0.80, which came out last week, adds support for source maps. What I didn't do, which I quickly realized I should have, is I don't have the option here. So you could say source maps are false for CJS. If you wanted to do that, we'll add that in the future. But yeah, with source maps it is really nice because you can if you're using BitTabs in your project and you want to, for some reason, debug BitTabs itself, well, you're actually seeing the original source. So yeah, still export is really nice. I'm going to write more about this. Like I said, it has a million options. If you go to StealJS, StealJS.com, under the API docs, there's a Still Tools export. I believe there's a guide as well. Yeah, there's a project exporting guide, which tells you a lot about the things that I've been talking about here, but you can also see all the different options because you can have a very complex build like Can has, and you can do pretty much whatever you need for it to do. So I think that maybe it's a good stopping point for me. We'll be talking more about Steel in the future. Probably do one where we talk about progressive loading and how you can add that to your project very easily and get all the benefits of that. So
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think that with CanJS 2.2 and with the new StealJS, well, I hope that we've kind of created these foundational pieces that should let people do what we're trying to do with Podovi components. And if people don't know what we're trying to do with Podovi components, we are trying to create our own little UI library, and we're starting to try to put whatever we can in there. None of it's going to be like great A+ components because it's kind of made, we're trying to do a lot instead of things that are great to kind of show how quickly and easily you can add a project. But we're hoping that everybody else who's using Steel and CanJS can start making their own little open source available projects built the same way, usable by everyone, and we'll create a very nice ecosystem of components or other CanJS tools that should help make our CanJS more popular and bring attention to it if there's a lot of utilities out there. But of course, that's only possible because of how easy StealJS makes it makes building out and maintaining an open source project, because it's a huge pain in the ass to maintain an open source project. Having done it with CanJS and getting all the different builds to work is just such a nightmare. And we're hopefully going to make the same kind of thing for testing and for documentation easier as well by the end of this year. One kind of integrated way to do open source, make it, quick to ship.
mm-hmm.
Cool.
Awesome.
Anybody who's still watching, thank you for watching. Hopefully we're going to start doing these more often, and I think we're going to put these links to certain parts of the video up in the blog articles we just released, so people can see the overviews.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome.
All right.
All right.
Matthew, David, thank you, and
fun.
I will talk to you later. Bye.
We'll do it again.